The blue pickup truck turned onto Elm Street just as the afternoon sun began to dip behind the jagged skyline of the old warehouses. It was a good truck, solid, expensive, and clean. It didn't belong on a street where the asphalt was cracked like a dry riverbed and the fences leaned tiredly against each other. Daniel Jackson sat behind the steering wheel, his hands gripping the leather-wrapped rim. His knuckles were clean now. His fingernails weren't stained with the grease of the local garage anymore. For 9 years, he had worked in the heat of the desert and the noise of foreign cities. He had climbed from a laborer to a foreman, and finally to a man who owned his own company. He had the money. He had the success. But as he looked at house number 44, his chest tightened. The house was smaller than he remembered. The white paint was no longer white. It was a bruised gray, peeling off in long, thin strips like dead skin. The roof on the left side had a visible sag, a heavy dip that told him the leak he had promised to fix 9 years ago had turned into a rot. Then he saw them. 2 bicycles. One blue, one red. They were leaned against the porch, their plastic handlebar streamers shivering in the light breeze. On the top step, a pair of small, muddy sneakers sat side by side, the laces tangled together. Daniel's heart did a strange, uncomfortable roll in his chest. He hadn't told his mother he was coming. He wanted the surprise. He wanted to walk in, drop a bag of cash on the kitchen table, and tell her that her days of selling breakfast sandwiches at the bus station were over. But the bikes didn't fit the plan. He got out of the truck, the door closing with a heavy, expensive thud that seemed to echo down the quiet street. He walked up the path, his boots crunching on the gravel. He noticed the drawings taped to the inside of the front window, colorful, messy pictures of suns and trees. He reached the door and hesitated. Then he knocked. Inside the house, Margaret Jackson was sitting at the kitchen table. She was 68 years old, but in the dim light of the kitchen, she looked 80. She was counting. 5 ones, 3 fives, a small pile of quarters. She smoothed the $1 bills flat with her palms. Her hands were a map of her life. The skin was thick and dry, the knuckles swollen from years of gripping heavy crates and stirring massive pots of porridge before the sun came up. They were the hands of a woman who had never been allowed to be tired. When the knock came, she didn't jump. She didn't expect anyone, but she was used to the unexpected. She stood up slowly, her knees popping like dry twigs, and walked to the door. She opened it, and for a second the world went completely silent. "Mama," Daniel said. Margaret didn't scream. She didn't drop to her knees. She simply stared at the man in the expensive blue jacket. She looked at his neat beard, the small lines at the corners of his eyes, and the way he stood, straight and tall, like a man who wasn't afraid of the world anymore. "Daniel," she whispered. Her voice was thin like paper. She stepped back, and he followed her in. He went to hug her, and he realized how small she had become. She felt like a bird in his arms, fragile, all bone and spirit. He held her tight, smelling the familiar scent of flour and peppermint tea. "I'm home, Mama," he said into her hair. "I'm back for good. You don't have to work anymore. I've got enough for both of us. For everything." Margaret pulled back, her eyes searching his face. There was a look in her eyes that Daniel couldn't read. It wasn't just joy. It was something heavier, something like fear. "Daniel," she said, her voice regaining some of its strength. "You're thin. You haven't been eating. Sit down. I'll make the eggs." "Mama, I don't need eggs. I want to talk. I want to tell you about—" He stopped. A sound came from the hallway, a soft, rhythmic thudding of footsteps. A boy appeared in the doorway. He was about 9 years old. He wore a faded red t-shirt and carried a thick notebook under his arm. He didn't look at Daniel first. He walked straight to Margaret, looked at her face for a long second, and then stood beside her. He didn't speak. He just watched. He had Daniel's eyes, the same deep, observant brown. "Grandma," the boy said, "is everything okay?" Daniel felt the air leave his lungs. "Grandma." Then a girl pushed past the boy. She was the same age, but while the boy was like a still pond, she was like a wildfire. She had big eyes and a chin that was held high, as if she were waiting for an argument. "Who's the man in the chair?" she asked. She didn't whisper. She said it directly, her arms folded across her chest. Daniel looked at his mother. His heart was beating so fast it hurt. "Mama? Who are they?" Margaret looked at the children, then back at her son. She reached out and put her hand on the kitchen counter to steady herself. "Daniel," she said, "these are your children." The kitchen went silent. It was the kind of silence that feels heavy, like the air before a massive storm. Daniel looked at the boy, Michael, and then at the girl, Michelle. He saw himself in the boy's quiet stare. He saw a flash of his own stubbornness in the girl's narrowed eyes. "Mine," Daniel whispered. The word felt like a stone in his mouth. "How can they be mine, Mama? I've been gone for 9 years. I didn't know." Margaret pulled out a chair. She sat down heavily, her knees cracking. She looked at the children. "Michael, Michelle, go to the sitting room for a moment. I need to talk to this man." "Is he a bill collector?" Michelle asked, not moving an inch. She had seen enough bill collectors in her 9 years to know they usually wore nice jackets and looked uncomfortable. "No, honey," Margaret said softly. "He's family. Just go for a minute." Michael took his sister's hand. He didn't say a word, but he led her out of the room. He glanced back at Daniel one last time, a look that was far too old for a 9-year-old. It was a look of assessment, as if he were deciding if Daniel was a threat. When the hallway was empty, Daniel leaned over the table. "Mama, talk to me. Right now." "Emily? Was it Emily?" Margaret nodded. She reached into the pocket of her faded apron and pulled out a crumpled tissue, pressing it to her eyes. "She came to the door 4 months after you left, Daniel. It was raining. She was 21, terrified, and so pregnant she could barely walk. She had no money. Her family had turned their backs. She had tried to call you, but you were moving around those construction sites in the desert. She couldn't reach you." Daniel closed his eyes. He remembered those first months. The noise, the heat, the constant moving from one camp to another. He had changed his SIM card 3 times. He thought he was being smart, focusing on the work. "She stayed here?" Daniel asked. "For 8 months after they were born," Margaret said. "She tried, Daniel. I want you to know she tried. But she was a child herself. One afternoon, she sat them in the crib, looked at me and said, 'I can't do this, Mrs. Jackson. I'm hollow inside.' She left that night. I haven't heard from her in 8 years." Daniel stood up and paced the small kitchen. 3 steps to the fridge, 3 steps back to the stove. The house felt like it was closing in on him. "And you didn't tell me? Every Sunday, every single phone call for 9 years. And you didn't say, 'Daniel, you have a son and a daughter?'" Margaret stood up too. She didn't look old anymore. She looked fierce. She pointed at the ceiling, at the water stain in the corner. "And tell you what? Tell you to come back here and drown with us? You were 23 years old and desperate to escape this life. If I told you, you would have hopped on the first plane. You would have come back here, taken a job at the garage, and spent the rest of your life bitter and broke. I saw the fire in you, Daniel. I decided to let that fire burn. It wasn't your choice to make." Daniel roared. "I made it anyway," Margaret fired back. "I got up at 4:30 every morning. I sold sandwiches in the freezing wind so they could have milk. I sold your father's silver watch so Michael could have his medicine. I didn't have the luxury of choices, Daniel. I only had the necessity of survival." She walked toward the hallway. "Wait here." She returned a minute later carrying a gray metal box. It was dented at the corners. She set it on the table between them and flipped the latch. "Everything is in here," she said, her voice dropping to a weary whisper. "The birth certificates, the photos, the letters I wrote to you but never sent because I was too afraid of what it would do to your future." Daniel reached into the box. His fingers brushed against a piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was a birth certificate. Name, Michael Daniel Jackson. He saw his own name listed as the father. He saw the date, February 14th, Valentine's Day. While he had been drinking beer with the other laborers in a dusty camp halfway across the world, celebrating his first big paycheck, His son had been entering the world in a cold hospital 3 miles from this house. He picked up a photo. It was a young woman with a round belly, standing by the very window he was looking out of now. Emily. She looked exhausted. She looked like she was waiting for someone who wasn't coming. "I've been a ghost," Daniel said, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "I've been a ghost in my own life." "You weren't a ghost to me," Margaret said, sitting back down. "You were the bank. The money you sent. It's the only reason we still have this roof over our heads. You provided, Daniel. You just didn't know who you were providing for." Daniel looked toward the sitting room. He could hear the low murmur of the children's voices. He felt a sudden, terrifying urge to run, to get back in his truck and drive until the city lights disappeared. How do you walk into a room and tell 2 strangers that you are the reason they don't have a father? But then he looked at his mother's hands. The skin was so thin it looked like parchment. The knuckles were swollen. He realized she hadn't just raised his children. She had shielded him from the burden of them. He didn't run. He sat down. "I want to see them," Daniel said. "But not as a friend. I want to do this right." "Then you better start by fixing that roof," Margaret said, a small, tired smile finally touching her lips. "Because Michael has been asking why his successful uncle hasn't sent a handyman yet." Daniel looked at the box one last time. "I'm not a handyman, Mama. I'm a builder. And I think it's time I started building something that actually matters." The first night in the house was the longest of Daniel's life. He lay in his old bedroom, the same room where he had dreamed of skyscrapers and fast cars, and listened to the house breathe. It was a wheezing breath. He could hear the drip, drip, drip of the bathroom faucet, a steady, rhythmic reminder of everything that had been neglected. Through the thin drywall, he heard a muffled giggle from the room next door, followed by a sharp shoo from Michelle. They were awake. They were talking about him. He stared at the ceiling. In his bank account, he had enough to buy a house 10 times this size in the city. He had the power to move them tomorrow. But as he looked at the water stain above his bed, he realized that moving them wouldn't fix the hole he had left in their lives. The next morning, Daniel didn't wait for his mother to wake up. He was out of bed at 5 a.m. He put on his work boots, grabbed a flashlight, and climbed into the attic. The air was thick with dust and the smell of old insulation. When he shone the light on the corner of the roof, his heart sank. The wood was black with rot. It wasn't just a leak. It was a wound. He touched the timber, and it crumbled like dry cake under his thumb. 9 years, he whispered to the dark. 9 years of this over their heads. He spent the morning in town. He didn't go to a fancy office. He went to the lumber yard. He bought shingles, plywood, rolls of flashing, and a new toolbox. When he backed his truck into the driveway at noon, Michael and Michelle were sitting on the porch steps, eating apples. They watched him like 2 hawks. "You're going up there?" Michelle asked, pointing a half-eaten apple at the roof. "I am," Daniel said, hoisting a bundle of shingles onto his shoulder. "Grandma says the roof is angry," Michael said quietly. He hadn't moved from his spot on the top step. His notebook was open on his knees. "She says it screams when it rains." Daniel stopped. He looked at the boy. "Well, I'm going to make it stop screaming, Michael. I promise." Michael didn't smile. He just looked down at his notebook and started drawing. By 3 p.m., the sun was beating down on Daniel's back. He was sweating, his shirt clinging to his skin, his muscles aching in a way they hadn't since he was a junior laborer. He was ripping away the old, gray shingles when he heard a voice from below. "Do you have a wife?" He looked over the edge. Michelle was standing at the base of the ladder, her head tilted back, her eyes narrowed against the sun. "No," Daniel said, wiping sweat from his forehead. "Do you have a dog?" "No dog." "Then why do you have such a big truck?" she asked. "If it's just you, a small car would be cheaper. Grandma says expensive things are usually a sign that someone is trying to hide a small heart." Daniel nearly dropped his hammer. He sat back on his heels, looking down at this fierce little girl. "I have a big truck because I carry heavy things, Michelle, like these shingles, and I don't have a small heart. I just..." I stayed away too long. Michelle didn't look convinced. James at school says men who go away to work are like shadows. You can see them, but you can't touch them. Are you a shadow? I'm standing right here, Daniel said. I'm made of skin and bone, just like you. We'll see, she said. She turned on her heel and marched back into the house. That evening, dinner was a quiet affair. Margaret had made beef stew. The steam rose from the bowls, filling the kitchen with a warmth that almost made things feel normal. Daniel watched Michael. The boy ate with a precision that was unnerving. He didn't spill a drop. He didn't talk. He just observed. Every time Daniel moved his hand to reach for the salt, Michael's eyes followed the movement. Michael, Daniel said, trying to break the ice. What are you drawing in that notebook of yours? Your grandma tells me you're quite the artist. Michael hesitated. He looked at Margaret, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. Slowly, Michael reached under the chair and pulled out the tattered notebook. He slid it across the table. Daniel opened it. He expected to see cartoons or messy scribbles. Instead, his breath caught. The pages were filled with mechanical drawings. Cranes, excavators, scaffolding. They weren't just pictures. They were blueprints. The lines were straight, the proportions were nearly perfect. Beside a drawing of a tower crane, there were small, neat numbers. Are these measurements? Daniel asked. The counterweight has to be 1.5 times the load capacity if the arm is at full extension, Michael said. His voice was no longer small. It was confident. Otherwise, it tips. I saw one in a book at the library. Daniel looked at his son. A surge of pride, so sharp it felt like a physical pain, hit him in the chest. Michael, I've seen professional engineers who can't get these angles right on the first try. Who taught you this? Nobody, Michael said, looking back at his stew. I just like to know how things stay up. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out his phone. He swiped through his gallery until he found a photo of his biggest project, a bridge project in the desert. He showed it to the boy. Look at this, Michael. This is a suspension cable system. Do you see the tensioners? For the first time, Michael's eyes lit up. He leaned in, his face inches from the screen. For 10 minutes, the two of them sat there, the father who had built the world, and the son who wanted to understand it. They didn't talk about the 9 years. They didn't talk about Emily. They talked about steel and gravity. But in the corner, Margaret was watching. She saw the way Daniel's hand hovered near Michael's shoulder, not quite brave enough to touch him yet. She saw the way Michael's wall was starting to crumble, just a little bit. It's a start, she whispered to herself. But the peace didn't last. Just as Daniel was showing Michael a video of a controlled demolition, the front door rattled. A heavy, aggressive knock echoed through the house. Margaret's face went pale. She looked at the clock. 9 p.m. Who is that, Mama? Daniel asked, his voice instantly dropping into a protective growl. It's the landlord's son, Margaret whispered. Mr. Henderson. He's been wanting this land for years. He says the house is a blight on the neighborhood. Daniel stood up. He didn't look like a builder anymore. He looked like a man who had been pushed too far. Sit back down, Mama, Daniel said, his eyes fixed on the door. I'll handle this. The knocking didn't stop. It was the sound of someone who owned the air you breathed and wanted you to know it. Daniel felt a cold, familiar anger rising in his chest, the kind of anger he usually reserved for subcontractors who tried to cut corners on his job sites. Stay here, Daniel said to the table. He didn't look back to see if they obeyed. He opened the front door, and the humid night air rushed in. Standing on the porch was a man in a polo shirt that was too tight around his middle, holding a clipboard like a weapon. This was Henderson Jr. He looked at Daniel, then at the shiny pickup truck in the driveway, then back at Daniel's work-stained clothes. Who are you? Henderson asked, not bothering with a greeting. I'm here to speak with Margaret. She's behind on the structural assessment fee. Again. I'm the man fixing this house, Daniel said, stepping onto the porch and closing the door behind him. He didn't want the children to hear this. And there is no structural assessment fee in a standard residential lease in this county. I checked the local codes this morning. Henderson stiffened. He wasn't used to people on Elm Street knowing the law. Listen, buddy, this place is a death trap. Look at that roof. Look at the foundation. My father has been generous letting an old woman and 2 kids stay here for pennies. But our patience is gone. We have a developer interested in the lot. If the repairs aren't certified by the end of the month, the eviction notice is already drafted. Daniel took a step closer. He was a head taller than Henderson, and his shoulders were broad from a decade of lifting steel. The roof is being finished tomorrow. The foundation is solid. And as for the pennies, I've been wiring the rent myself for 9 years. I know exactly how much has been paid. You aren't getting this lot, and you aren't bothering my mother again. Your mother? Henderson sneered, though he backed up a step toward his car. Funny, she never mentioned a son. Just a benefactor who lived overseas. I figured you were just a ghost she made up to keep us from kicking her out. The ghost is home, Daniel said, his voice a low, dangerous vibration. Get off the porch. If I see your car on the street again without an official appointment, I'll call the sheriff and report you for harassment. Am I clear? Henderson didn't argue. He muttered something about legal channels and scrambled into his car. Daniel watched the taillights disappear around the corner before he let out a long, shaky breath. When he turned back to the door, Margaret was standing there. She looked small in the shadows of the hallway. He's been coming every week, hasn't he? Daniel asked. He wants the land, Daniel, she whispered. He thinks because I'm old and alone, I'll just fold. He's been adding fees to the rent for 2 years. Couldn't tell you. I didn't want you to worry about the house on top of everything else. Daniel reached out and took his mother's hands. For the first time, he noticed a bandage on her thumb he hadn't seen before. You've been fighting a war, Mama. Alone. In the dark. I wasn't alone, she said, looking toward the kitchen where Michael and Michelle were waiting. I had them.
I missed
They keep
you,
me
Mama.
upright, Daniel,
I'm finally
even
home.
when my knees want to give out. The next morning, the reconstruction took on a new urgency. Daniel wasn't just fixing a house anymore. He was fortifying a fortress. He worked with a fever. He replaced the rotted fascia boards. He cleared the gutters. He spent 4 hours under the house, crawling through the damp dirt to reinforce the floor joists. At noon, Michelle brought him a glass of water. She didn't leave immediately. She watched him work for a long time. Grandma says you're leaving soon, she said. Daniel stopped, his wrench halfway through a turn. Why does she say that? Because that's what men do, Michelle said. She sat on a pile of bricks, her legs swinging. They come, they fix something, they give us a little bit of money, and then they go away to a place where the buildings are taller and the streets don't have cracks. Daniel climbed out from under the porch, wiping grease from his face. I have a business in the city, Michelle. I have workers who depend on me. But that doesn't mean I'm leaving you. But you aren't our father, she said. It wasn't a question. It was a challenge. Daniel felt a sharp pang in his chest. He looked at her, the same big eyes as Emily, but the same stubborn chin as his own. I am, Michelle. I'm your father. I didn't know you existed until 3 weeks ago, and that's a hole in my life that I'm never going to be able to fill. But I'm here now. Prove it, she said. How? Michael wants to go to the museum, she said. The one with the big machines. Grandma can't take us because the bus takes 3 hours and her legs hurt too much. Shadows don't go to museums. Only fathers do. Daniel smiled. It was the first real, unburdened smile he'd had in a decade. Clean your shoes, Michelle. We're going. The trip to the Science and Industry Museum was a turning point. In the back of the truck, the children sat in a state of quiet shock. They had rarely left the 4-block radius of Elm Street. Inside the museum, Michael was transformed. He stood in front of a massive steam engine, his mouth slightly open, his notebook forgotten in his hand. He wasn't drawing now, he was absorbing. Look at the piston, Daniel, Michael whispered, pointing to the massive iron arm. It's not just moving. It's breathing. If the seal fails, the whole thing dies. Just like a heart, Daniel said, crouching down beside him. They spent hours in the engineering wing. Daniel explained torque, tension, and structural integrity. He talked to Michael like a colleague, and for the first time, the boy reached out and touched Daniel's arm to point something out. It was a small gesture, but to Daniel it felt like a medal of honor. Michelle, meanwhile, was busy interrogating the museum staff about why the exhibits weren't interactive enough. She led the way through the hallways like a tiny general, making sure Daniel was keeping up. On the way home, as the sun began to set, the truck was filled with a different kind of silence. Peaceful one. "Daniel?" Michael asked from the back seat. "Yeah, Michael? Can you teach me how to use a real level? The one with the bubble?" "Tomorrow morning," Daniel said. "First thing." "Okay," Michael said. "Good." By the end of the second week, the house on Elm Street looked like it belonged in a different neighborhood. The roof was a deep, solid charcoal. The front porch didn't creak. The kitchen window closed with a crisp, satisfying click. But the real work was happening inside. Daniel sat with Margaret in the kitchen while the kids slept. He pulled out his laptop and showed her a set of papers. "I've bought the lot next door," Daniel said, "and I've paid off the lease on this house for the next 5 years in your name. Henderson can't touch you. Nobody can." Margaret looked at the screen, her eyes filling with tears. "Daniel, you've done enough. You've fixed the house." "I haven't even started, Mama," Daniel said. "I'm opening a branch of my company here, in this town. I'm tired of being a ghost. I want to see Michael graduate. I want to see Michelle run for mayor, which I'm pretty sure she's going to do by the time she's 12. Margaret laughed. A bright, clear sound that seemed to chase the last of the shadows out of the kitchen. The story of Daniel Jackson didn't end with a grand speech or a dramatic sunset. It ended in the small, quiet moments of a Friday morning. It ended with Daniel standing on the sidewalk, watching his son and daughter walk toward the school bus. Michael was carrying his notebook, but he turned back at the corner and waved. A real wave, full of light. Michelle didn't wave. She pointed at her watch, reminding Daniel that he had promised to fix her bike chain by 3 p.m. sharp. Daniel turned back to the house. His mother was on the porch, sitting in a new chair, her hands resting in her lap. They weren't counting pennies anymore. He realized then that he hadn't just come home to be a hero. He had come home to be a son, and a father, and a man who finally understood that the strongest structures in the world aren't made of steel or concrete. They are made of the things we carry for each other when the world gets dark. They are made of the 4:30 a.m. shifts, the silver watches sold in secret, and the decision to keep standing, no matter how many years it takes for the light to find its way back home. Daniel picked up his hammer, looked at the house one last time, and got back to work.